Welcome in to the B-Sides of Sports. This is our Season 3, Episode 10, and today Drake and I are going to take on some of the NFL and NBA trending headlines and just topics around both of those leagues. Before we jump into things, Drake and I just really wanted to give a shout out of appreciation to the support we've seen on our recent content across our Spotify podcast, the YouTube videos, the shorts, as well as the TikTok. We've seen a lot of support, and we just really appreciate it. It really encourages us on this journey of being kind of content creators and just sports media broadcasters in the larger scheme of things. So we really appreciate it, and we hope you guys continue to stick around. So with that being said, we're going to jump right into the NFL. And so unlike what we've done the last couple of weeks covering some of the games that have happened across the week, Drake and I wanted to take on some of the bigger headlines and some of the national media storylines that have come out across, just the entire season, as well as we head into this final stretch before the postseason. So we kind of wanted to start with a conversation around Brock Purdy and whether or not he deserves to be in the NFL MVP conversation. Obviously, we know that the numbers are gaudy, and the team is having a lot of success, currently sitting at number one in the NFC. So Drake, do you think Purdy deserves a name in the conversation, and why or why not?
So I think what my opinion on this is that I do believe, he deserves a spot in there, but to say he's a front runner is I think where I have more of the issues, because again, I think Christian McCaffrey's doing more impressive, but to focus more on him for the second is just what he's doing is good. But if you look at Jimmy Garoppolo through 13 games in the famous season when they went to the Super Bowl, first Brock Purdy through 13 games as well. Now, Jimmy Garoppolo would get injured at the end of the year and only play 13 games, but the stats are very similar. Both had around 27 touchdowns, both had right around 10 interceptions, and Jimmy Garoppolo didn't have nearly the running back room that he did. So again, I look at things like that, and that's something that first tells me, well, okay, maybe it's not Brock Purdy, but still what he's doing, with the completion percentage of being over 70 on the year, the very good touchdown to interception ratio, all of that stuff's very impressive. But so then I was just looking at the numbers because, when I think MVP, I think of like, if you take a guy off a team, how much value does he have, right? How good would the team be? And so one of the things I just started to look at was like his attempts, because I was almost shocked to see that through 13 games, he had only 359 attempts. I was just kind of surprised by that. So then I started to look at other players who I think are having good years and also have a lot of value to their team. And so a guy like Baker Mayfield through 13 games has more completions and almost 100 more attempts, meaning that's essentially 4 games worth of attempts on average for Purdy. He would have to play 4 more games to have a similar number. Patrick Mahomes, he's struggling this year, right? Having a down year, still has, I think, 70 more completions and over 100 more attempts. Lamar Jackson, this is a run first guy. This is a guy we think of as a guy who, he's not, right? He's on one of the best rushing teams in the league. There's no way he'd have more, but he has more completions and, if I have the numbers, only 20 more attempts, but still, this is for a guy who's been labeled as a sort of, a running quarterback, a dual threat. So when I'm looking at numbers like that, and then I look at Christian McCaffrey, who's on pace to break the all-time scrimmage yards, it's just kind of hard for me to give Purdy the nudge, just because, again, his team's great, don't get me wrong, but it's the same reason I don't think Jalen Hurts should have won last year, is you need to do it for a few years, I think, before you can get your name in the hat. And I know that that's not how the award is technically supposed to work, but in my opinion, how are you the most valuable player when we don't even really know what your value is to the team? We have only 18 regular season games. That's one full season of Brock Purdy that we've seen. I just haven't seen enough to know what he actually means to his team. Well, as guys like Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, those guys have proven what they mean to the team year in and year out. With Purdy, we just don't have that. And some people aren't going to like that because MVP is technically a decision based on that year. You're just supposed to look at that year. But as we all know, that's just not how the award's graded. And so by going by those criteria, I just don't think I mean, I'd say he's maybe top 5 in voting, but I wouldn't have him winning the award by any stretch.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would even go a step further to say I don't necessarily think that Purdy deserves to be in the MVP conversation as a whole. And I guess that kind of depends on how big you want that conversation to be, right? If we're going 10, 15 guys deep, sure, he might come up in that list. But to me, I just don't think he should be in the core conversation. And I definitely don't think he should be the front runner. And I think this is for a number of reasons. I would start with just the historical precedent point that you were kind of bringing up. And I think when we look at these awards and the value that they bring, right? Yes, it is a snapshot of the year that people are having, whether it be a quarterback or anyone else on the field. But I also think it's important to kind of think when we look at NFL history, kind of the weight that an NFL MVP award carries. And so I'll use the NBA as an example for this. A couple years ago when Nikola Jokic was, rattling off MVP after MVP, I had come out and said that I didn't think Nikola Jokic should be the second or the third 3-time consecutive, like 3 in a row MVP. I didn't think he was that caliber of player. Now, in hindsight, I think he might have rewritten some of that, especially with winning the title this past year. But in the moment, what I was really considering was the historical precedent and thinking that there had only been 1 or 2 guys to ever have done that. And those are Mount Rushmore guys, right? I think Bird was one of the players that had done that. And for Jokic to have his name in the hat without a title, to me, was kind of just a little bit absurd. And I thought we were being a little bit prisoner of the moment. And that's kind of how I feel about Purdy. You're right. The year he's having is really good, but you use the Jimmy G comparison. I would go further to say that I don't necessarily know if Brock is the best player on his own team's offense, right? We know what Christian McCaffrey's doing. And on top of having guys like Debo, Ayuk, and even George Kittle at his disposal, I think it speaks a lot to the system. And there's a lot of kind of negative connotation around game manager or system QB. And I don't want those to sound like insults, right? Like Brock Purdy plays incredibly well for the game manager or the system QB that he's asked to be in that system, right? But I think we saw in that 3-game sample size against the Vikings, the Bengals, as well as I'm slipping one.
The Browns?
The Browns, excuse me. We saw in that 3-game slide, right? Not having Debo and even Trent Williams for parts of those games out of the system, right? Purdy really, really struggled. And, there was the concussion controversy. He had the game where Jake Moody, the kicker, missed the field goal. But in that we saw Purdy was asked to be a bigger part of that offense, and he wasn't really able to come through. And for those reasons, I just think it's important to contextualize, right? We'd be given the award to a guy who's not even necessarily the most important or most valuable offensive player in his own team. And then in a couple of years, right? Say Brock Purdy goes on to a different team and he doesn't play at this high level, I think it'll just look like a little bit of a historical anomaly. And that's why I think it's important to really consider kind of just the precedents as well as just the larger picture of whether or not he can win the award this year. And so for all of that, I would say I just don't even think Brock Purdy should be in the NFL MVP conversation, even though he is the QB for his team. I think there's a little bit of hyperinflation of the value of the quarterback for the team just because he's playing that position for the Niners and they're one of the best teams in the league. We're wanting to put him in that conversation.
No, I agree. And I think it's kind of like this where Jimmy G took him to a Super Bowl, so until I see Brock Purdy do something better than that, how am I able to differentiate him than the guy who had the team humming before him in all things considered?
And I would just add, right, like the Jimmy G, right? We saw Jimmy G go to the Raiders this year, and I don't know about you, but to me, it does not look successful at all, right? And obviously now they're playing with Aiden O'Connell, but I think we really saw, Jimmy played really well in the system, right? He was a perfect system, not a perfect, but he was a very strong system QB for what Shanahan and that offense were demanding of him. But I think if we had given Jimmy G, say the MVP in that year, he had numbers that were very similar to Brock's this year. Even just now, 3-4 years removed, I think we look at that and we'd be shocked, like how we as, just a national media and as a national fans of football kind of crown Jimmy G an MVP of the NFL, right? It's the most prestigious award the league has to offer. So for all of that, I just think it's a little bit of a hyperinflation of the quarterback position.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then my actual last thing is, so I think it just kind of looks like with the Purdy and Jimmy G thing, it really is an issue of like you said, they're so similar, and we saw Jimmy G go to a different team and not succeed. And we saw when Brock Purdy was in those games where he had to make the throws, he couldn't win, which both were issues of Jimmy Garoppolo, right? If they had to throw, they were going to lose if they couldn't rely on the run game. So I'm just curious to see, again, we'll never see Brock Purdy out of that system probably for the next few years. And I think, though, the story of Brock Purdy at first kept him out of the MVP conversation. There was a lot of critiques, early on when he was killing it. People are like, oh, well, I think if he's a top 5 pick, he's the front runner for MVP. Now I think that's almost flipped on its head. I think now we're so in love with the story and the narrative of him actually winning MVP. I think he's benefiting from that. And I think the odds makers know that in Vegas.
Yeah, and it is really a narrative-based award, right? I was telling you the other day, I thought it was a little funny, right? Now he's the Vegas favorite, right? I don't know if the odds have changed after today's slate, but he was the Vegas favorite going into the weekend to win the NFL MVP. And with that, we could go back to that 3-game slide. You can find there are media members that were asking Shanahan questions on whether or not Darnold would be considered the starter for the team. And I just think it's a little funny and a little kind of, we're losing sight of the picture, right? We're getting caught up in the moment. If in the same season, we can go from questioning whether or not this guy should be the starter for his own team, and then moving to, we actually think he's the NFL MVP. So just with all of that, I think it's a little absurd. And, in today's era of short form content, right? We're victims of it too. But I think people get caught up in just having the hot take sometimes. And when those get a little bit of momentum, I think that's where we kind of spiral and find ourselves having the conversation we're having right now.
No, I agree. And then so I think now going into our next topic, looking at the division leaders, I think in these last few weeks we've seen some teams that even us have called Super Bowl contenders fall from grace. And I think namely the Lions and Dolphins. So outside of the division leaders right now, thinking Chiefs or oh shoot, now they're also me Chiefs, San Fran,
Ravens.
Baltimore. Yeah. When you think of the teams like that versus teams like Lions and Dolphins, there's a little bit of a difference. So, it's again this issue of, are they pretenders? Are they contenders? What do they feel? So Wilson, how do you kind of feel about those two teams going forward? I know they did both just have very impressive wins today, which I think, again, also kind of makes the conversation a little more difficult, but still curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to throw that in. It's an interesting day for us to have this conversation, considering how good the Dolphins looked without Tyreek today, and how dominant of a showing the Lions had against the Broncos that did have some momentum going into that game yesterday. That being said, I just think the questions that we had about these teams earlier in the season continue to persist, right? The Dolphins, I've always kind of questioned their kind of speed model of offense, how sustainable that can be going into the latter half of the year, especially as we reach colder weather. And again, today they had a really strong showing, and that was without Tyreek. It was really impressive by Jalen Waddle, really stepped up into the wide receiver one role, and Tua himself had a pretty strong game. Raheem Mostert continues to just be a touchdown machine. And on the Lions side of things, Goff really found his kind of swing and grew 5 passing touchdowns. Is not a feat to be ashamed of. Super, super impressive. But all that to say, I just think both of these teams still feel a little bit young, and I think in a quarterback-driven league, Goff and Tua just are a slight bit below the tier that I think those quarterbacks would need to be with those given rosters in order to truly contend at the highest level, right? Goff has had some really amazing stretches of football, and I think he really redefined the narrative coming over from the Rams, just his ability to kind of carry a team, and whether or not it was McVay behind the success or if Goff himself is a good quarterback. And again, I don't think, Goff is definitely an above average quarterback in the league right now. But I still think you need, just given the roster as a whole, the defense has struggled at times. And, I think you need a top, 5 to 8 guy to really, really feel confident about your standing, right? It just look across the NFC, right? Dak has proven to be pretty sustainable and pretty consistent, right? He doesn't have the turnover problems that plague Goff at times. Jalen Hurts, we just saw him and his leadership really take the Eagles to a new level last year. And even with the Niners, right? I just think the Niners have an overall top to bottom better roster than the Detroit does. And for all those reasons, I think Detroit just finds themselves in that tier right below them. And then with the Dolphin side of things, I will say the AFC feels more open than in years past, but I have a hard time seeing them being able to match the physicality of the Ravens, the Browns, or even the Chiefs, right? The Chiefs defense this year has been super, super strong, and they're really physical at the line of scrimmage. And I just don't see the Dolphins being able to match that.
No, I agree. And I think my biggest thing with Detroit is just still the defense. Let me say first, it's what Cam Newton said this week on his podcast, right? He was labeling people game managers, and everyone was so critical to defend these guys. And it's like Wilson said, I don't even think necessarily game managers just a knock if we consider every starting QB in the NFL to be a superstar Josh Allen caliber talent, right? So I think we need to realize game manager is just a very realistic categorization of a lot of quarterbacks. Like, I think Kirk Cousins is a great quarterback. I think he's arguably a top 10 quarterback. I'd still say he's probably more of a game manager than a game changer. And that's fine. Like, I don't understand why this moniker is such a bad thing. And it might be because the players just don't want to get into those titles, because when it comes to contract negotiations or things like that. But regardless, I don't think of that title as a bad thing, because I think you can win with Tua and Jared Goff at this point. I think they've both proven enough. Detroit's side completely falls on the defense to me, as well as the Ben Johnson sweepstakes. One of the hottest topics for offensive or to be a new head coach with how much success offensive coordinators have had. I think they're just kind of having an issue right now of they really are in win now mode. And I think that it's kind of swayed their play calling. They've had a lot of questionable decisions. You have one of the best running back tandems in the league, and Jared Goff's playing hero ball most of the time. Again, he's a game manager. That's just not what you want. And their defense is not top 10 in any category, and it's not top 20 in passing and total yards. That's just not a winning formula. And they do get Chancey Gardner-Johnson here soon. But again, I just think that their issues kind of fall more in playing hero ball, the Ben Johnson drama, and the defense. While as Miami, again, I just think it's the unsustainable model of beating up on, they're like the Bills of years past. It's the same reason the Bills could never win. They beat up on bad teams and they struggle against good teams. It's not an indictment to their style. It's an indictment to they're better coached than 20 teams in the league. But those 10 teams that they aren't better coached than and better ran than, they're going to lose to every time just because, again, they're a young team. They're a few years out of their window. I personally would buy in more to Miami being a true contender more or sooner rather than later. And that's just because, again, I think what Mike McDaniel is doing is he's putting in a very cool culture there. And I think it's working, right? It's kind of hard to be that player coach because sometimes players start walking all over you. It's what we kind of saw with Tomlin in Pittsburgh with all of his drama that he just seems to breed in that locker room. But Mike McDaniels hasn't had that yet. And they've had a lot of unfortunate injury luck, but they're still a competent team, not having Jalen Ramsey, one of the best corners in football for most of the year, and they're still in this position. So I agree with you where I just think it's not their year, and that's fine. If I'm them, I'm not tanking now at this point, but go for the playoffs, see what you can do, see what all your team does, evaluate everyone, and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we want to touch on the Jaguars in just one moment. But the last thing I wanted to add about the Dolphins and the Lions is I would have felt better about both of these teams heading into the postseason had they been able to secure home seed advantage. That's still up to be determined, right? The Dolphins control their own destiny. If they're able to beat Baltimore and just win out, they'll be able to secure the number one seed. As well as the Lions are kind of in a tough position where they do need a Niners loss, and then they'll need a couple tiebreakers to go their way. But for both of these teams, I think it's really important to kind of see the progression of success you have as an overall team and just kind of the confidence and belief within that building, right? I think both of these teams are really hot, but for Detroit from going to not being in the postseason a year ago to coming in and being a true Super Bowl contender, I just think that's a little bit of a leap. And even the Dolphins last year, right? Tua wasn't the starting QB in that playoff game. So I think those are things that matter. And I would have felt a lot better about both of these rosters had they been able to secure that number one seed, the bye in the first round of the playoffs, and just have home field up into the Super Bowl. Jumping over to the Jaguars side of things, then I think the Jags are the other team in kind of this division leader or a conversation that we're having on whether or not I'm sold as them if they're a true contender, right? And I think earlier in the year I was starting to lean towards yes. Trevor Lawrence looked like he had taken a step, and the run game was just incredible with Etienne and what they were able to do. That being said, to me, the momentum for the Jaguars feels a little bit flipped from what it was a year ago, where last year they really stumbled out of the gate and got hot late, kind of steamrolling into the postseason. And they looked really good. Obviously, they then were taken down by the Chiefs, but I don't think that was a loss to be ashamed of. And then this year, they started off really hot. I think carrying over from last year at one point, they had won 11 of 13 regular season games, not against the Chiefs. Since then they've kind of stumbled, had a couple losses against the Bengals and the Browns. They kind of got steamrolled by the Niners. And I'm really starting to kind of question if Trevor Lawrence is able to ascend to the player we thought he was going to be able to be coming out of the draft. And it's not to say he's not a good quarterback. He is. And I think, again, he's one of those guys that is probably above league average, but the turnovers continue to plague him. He's fumbling the ball at an absurdly high rate, and he throws a ton of interceptions. And for a guy that doesn't necessarily produce in an incredible amount of touchdowns, I just think it's a tough balance to kind of produce, right? Because the passing game's been able to produce yardage, but they haven't been really able to convert in the red zone. And for all those things, I think the Jaguars are another team that feels like they're a year or two away from being a true title contender.
Yeah, see, I think the issue with them is it is Trevor Lawrence and kind of the expectation of him to be this. Again, people were saying he's the best prospect since Luck, the best prospect ever. All these titles are being throwing around, and I honestly just think that he's a game manager with the body of a god, right? I mean, he has the perfect profile of what you'd want for a QB. He's very fast for his side. He takes very long strides. He's 6'5", stands tall in the pocket, has a great arm, but doesn't throw a great deep ball. He's not the one hyping up his players at the end of the game, telling them, right? There are these certain things that, like, it's why I like a guy like Baker Mayfield so much and why I've always thought in the right circumstance he could succeed. He's a game manager, but he has that X factor, right, of loving to throw deep balls, which is very ungame manager-like, except for a guy like Flacco, who kind of made that a notorious part of his game, and as well as being a leader. You usually don't see that in a game manager, but Baker is both those things. That's why I've been so high on him this year, and I think it's one of the reasons he just went into Lambeau and threw only the second player to ever throw a perfect quarterback rating in Lambeau besides Aaron Rodgers. And again, I'm not saying Trevor Lawrence's ceiling is so much higher than Baker Mayfield's, and that's not an indictment on Baker Mayfield. But I think Trevor Lawrence's issue is it's kind of all the stuff that's always been the issue with him, and it gets better, but the issue still remains. And I just think unless they put a all-star cast around him, I just think, again, I think he's a glorified game manager.
Yeah, I agree with that. With that, then I think we'll jump into the last topic of our NFLA block here. And I kind of wanted to discuss here some of the teams in the playoff hunt. So we know there's been a little bit of a logjam with the wildcard spots in both the AFC and the NFC. And, the AFC teams have a little bit of better records than the NFC, but in both cases, there's kind of just a jam log of a bunch of teams that are kind of in the hunt and just hovering around those wild card spots. So we'll start with the AFC here. You got a combination of teams here ranging from the Bills, the Broncos, Browns, Bengals, Steelers. Everyone in the AFC North is really in there, as well as, suddenly the Colts and the Texans find themselves in that battle as well. Who are some of the teams you like with their season outlook heading into the postseason and finding momentum at the right time in the AFC?
So of all of the teams kind of in the hunt that aren't, these sort of division leaders, I think there's, in my opinion, only one on each side that are true contenders. And a lot of that's just because of certain issues. The Bengals, in my opinion, as great as Jake Browning is, he's never been to the Super Bowl before, right? He's never been in the playoffs before. He's kind of a tenured backup guy. So I think, I think they could maybe win a game, in the playoffs, a game or two if they're really lucky, just because their team has been there. Very recently, they went to a Super Bowl. So there's a lot of veterans on that team. But that and their very weak secondary, I just don't see them making it. The Texans, they have a rookie QB. As awesome as a story as it is, I just don't think it makes much sense. It's better for them at this point to be out of the playoffs, get a better draft pick, and just keep building around what is showing to be maybe one of the best rookie quarterbacks we've ever seen. And then going on to the Colts, they're on their backup quarterback. They're on their third string running back. Their number one receiver's out for another week. The injury bugs just hit them at the worst time. And I think, not to mention, Gardner Minshew, I think, has played great for them, but with everyone else banged up as well, I just don't think it's very, very sustainable business model, very similar to same reason I put the Browns. They're just too banged up. It's a fun story, but you're going to make it to the playoffs and probably get waxed. But then my actual contender, I think, is the Bills. And that's just because, again, I don't think there's an argument to be made on paper that there isn't a more explosive offense in the league. Dalton Kincaid is showing to be maybe he'd be the best rookie tight end in the league right now if Sam Laporta didn't exist. So almost any other year, Kincaid would be seen as the best. Stephon Diggs is one of the best route runners in the NFL, one of the best receivers against man in the NFL. Maybe when he's retired in NFL history, he's just so surgical with how he runs routes and gets separation. You have Josh Allen, who's maybe the most freak of nature quarterback we've ever seen in terms of sheer size, speed, and arm talent. And then you throw in James Cook, who I just had this stat that I want to pull up. Since they fired Ken Dorsey, before James Cook was averaging about 86 yards a game. Since then, he's averaging 146, and they have won, they've won 3 of their last 4, and they have over 400 yards of offense in 3 of those games. So I'm just going to leave that there. I think once he's left, it's really opened up the playbook. I think they've let Josh take more of the reins, and as well as the run game, letting that take over. So to me, they're the AFC contender. If I was saying all the AFC teams in the hunt, that is a team that I think genuinely could be the 1 seed if a few other games went in their favor.
Yeah, the AFC is really interesting to me because outside of the division leaders, right, the Dolphins with Tua, the Chiefs with Mahomes, the Ravens with Lamar, and the Jags with Trevor Lawrence, every single one of the wildcard teams, other than the Bills, are currently playing a backup QB. I guess the Broncos still have Wilson, but the Bengals, right? Obviously, Deshaun's not playing. The Bengals, Burrow's out for the season. The Steelers, Kenny Pickett's been out. The Colts, Richardson was out for the season, and even the Texans, right? They had to play Case Keenum today, and so with all of that, I think it makes it very tough for any of these teams to feel like they have the right momentum in order to be a true caliber Super Bowl contender, right? Like none of these teams have 2 quarterbacks that are able to take them to the Super Bowl on their roster, right? So if they're playing the backup, they're not in a good position. And so, to your point about the Bills, I think the Bills definitely have the highest ceiling of any of those teams, right? We know the game over game variance for the Bills. And I think to me, the question is just, can a team that was playing truly like 500 level football across the first half of the season really turn the season around? And we've seen the Bengals do it before in the past, right? The Bengals have had some really slow starts to seasons and getting hot. Yeah, I think last year they rallied 7-8 straight to end that season. We'll see if the Bills are able to do something similar here. I will say I haven't been totally convinced by either of their wins, both last week and this week. Obviously, it's important to get those wins out, but Allen was very pedestrian today. Part of that was just the run game was so successful against Dallas, and a lot of credit to James Cook and your point about that. But I think Allen himself has got to really find himself back on kind of reaching the ceiling that he has, right? And just being consistent with that, because he can be a turnover machine at times and he's really always gunning for that home run play. And I think that variance could knock them out of just even being in this wild card hunt, right? The Bills, although they have 8-6, along with a couple other teams in the hunt, they have a lot of those tiebreakers are not going to be going their way because they have a very poor conference record. And that's going to be the tiebreaker for a lot of these teams that didn't end up playing head to head. So I think that's interesting to note. The Bills in their attempt to make it into the playoff.
See, and I think though I still just disagree with Josh Allen, because what's so impressive to me is, like you said, the turnovers are an issue, but he still is with all of these issues and these turnovers. And again, Mike Greenberg said it a few weeks ago on ESPN as well, where it's like, I don't think Josh Allen's turnovers are what's losing them games. He's still, with all of these turnovers, again, remember, he's a turnover monster. He leads the league. He's the worst. He still has a 93 quarterback rating, a 70 QBR, as well as 67% completion, with 3,500 yards and 25 touchdowns and like a crap load on the ground and 10 rushing touchdowns. So to me, again, I don't think it's ever been Josh Allen. I think it's more of a question of if the team can win the ugly games, and they're finally doing that when Allen doesn't have to throw. Him only throwing 91 yards today, I think that, to me, has showed me more from the Bills than I have seen in years. Look at Mahomes' Super Bowls that he's won. He wasn't the best player on the field, which is an insane thing to say. But Damian Williams, their running back, in my opinion, he still should have won MVP. I think Mahomes only threw for about 200 in his Super Bowl. And then you look at the other one, Jalen Hurts just completely outplayed him. Jalen Hurts was the best player in that Super Bowl. So when I'm looking at things like this, to me, what it shows is, when you get to those big games, sometimes if your big players get you there, it's on everyone else to help, right? They'll help you. They're going to do what they do, but I think you have to look to everyone else. I think it's why Nick Foles was able to take the Eagles to a Super Bowl, right? Sometimes with how quarterback dominant the game has become, I think we forget that for 50 years, running backs and defense have won this league. And I still just prescribe to the old moniker of defense wins championships. And the Bills defense is playing good and they control the ball well. And again, that's where I think Allen's turnovers would have hurt them. But guess what? They finally committed to running the ball. So Allen didn't need to throw the ball and risk a turnover. To me, the Bills don't have any expectations because a lot of people have written them off. I think this is their best chance. I think the Bills are almost a team built to come from behind. They're a gritty blue collar fan base up there in Buffalo, not gritty, not pretty. So a guy like Josh Allen fits that moniker so well. He gets a bunch of ugly yards. Now they have James Cook getting all those ugly yards. They play in a disgusting stadium that I've personally been to. Beautiful stadium, disgusting environment in terms of the weather and just overall. I mean, whoever's genius idea it was to build it on a lake is mind-boggling to me. But I really just think that the Bills, I think genuinely this is the most I've liked the Bills to win the Super Bowl ever, and they aren't even in the playoffs right now. And that's just because I finally think they figured out our quarterback doesn't have to do everything. The best teams, the quarterback isn't doing everything. It's the teams that can win other ways, and they're finally prescribing to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And to your point about Allen, right, I think that's been my biggest criticism of him, right? He's felt the need to kind of go superhuman. And because of that, right, when 80% of the offense is falling on the shoulders of Allen, that's kind of a standard that even Mahomes isn't asked to achieve week in and week out, right? And I think sometimes those red zone turnovers, whether it's a pick or the fumble, they're a little bit magnified because he's asked to do so much. So I would tend to agree with you a little bit there. Switching over to the NFC side of things then, obviously some of the wild card teams here are sitting at 500 or below 500 records. We're looking at the Rams, the Seahawks, Vikings, the Packers are slipping a bit. And then obviously we have the jumble, that's the NFC South, where surprisingly one or two of those teams could slip into this kind of wild card madness we're seeing on the NFC side of things. Who do you like in this bunch, whether you view them as a true contender or just as a team that's likely to make it into the wild card?
So I don't like the Saints just because of the red zone ineptitude. It's mind-boggling to me that you have Chris Olave, Taysom Hill, Alvin Kamara, and you can't score in the red zone, and it's just an indictment on Carr. It's kind of been there his whole career. Defense is legit. Everything else seems to be legit, but again, the perpetual rebuild and the salary cap hell they're in has made it, in my opinion, impossible for them to win. The Seahawks, as high as we both were on them going into the year, I just think we saw that this roster had so many holes, and having a guy like Geno, who is more of a game manager, and in the later half of his career, just don't think it was ever going to be necessarily a winning model. Not an indictment to them, just they tried something no one had ever really tried before, and it just isn't really working. The Vikings, they've had like 18 starting quarterbacks at this point and no run game. I don't have them as a true contender, but I will say I do love the Rams, and that's just because they have won a Super Bowl. They do have a running back now. Kyron Williams is the first running back they've had since Todd Gurley to have over 1,000 scrimmage yards in a season. Looking really to be a every down back, a very versatile guy. The one thing I will say, I was diving into the numbers a little bit to see, because I think their record reflects on them a lot worse than they actually are. In games where their defense let over 350 yards, they're 0-4. So it just kind of seems like now they have this cap where they're a great team. They have so many playmakers, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Kieran Williams, Matt Stafford, but Stafford's getting older. He can't play hero ball every single game. So they need the games to be a little closer. And that's why I think the emergence of Kieran Williams, as well as the defense finally starting to shore up, and they haven't allowed, they did their last loss. They allowed over 400 to Baltimore, but since then they've been on a streak. They allowed under 350 yards on all of their games in their 3-game win streak in November. So when I'm looking at that, you need the defense to perform better, because the offense has been pretty consistent all year, getting about 300 yards a game. So I just think it really comes down to if the defense can shore up.
Yeah, you stole my thunder there. The Rams are truly the only team in kind of this bucket of the NFC that I really view as a team that would be fun or dangerous in the postseason. And even with that, I don't think they're just at the true contender level. The O-line is still a little bit suspect. I will say the coaching in the NFC West division is just a treasure chest, right? Shanahan, McVay, Carroll, and Gannon. Now, I just think it's a really fun division to watch. Kind of just the divisional matchups have been good. And, although the Niners kind of feel like the juggernaut, kind of the superpower there, I think the games themselves can still play out a little bit differently. We know the coaching edges and kind of some of the rivalries that have existed there. But the Rams really are the only team that stick out to me. I really like the Packers and some of the momentum they had. There had been that stat, LaFleur had been so good in December, but looking back on it a little bit, some of that, or a lot of that, is probably attested to just having Rodgers. And we know last year them really trying to make that postseason push. A lot of that was just on the shoulders of Rodgers and kind of elevating the roster and the belief around them. So again, I'm with you here. I think the Rams are the only team that could make it interesting, and I am sad to see the Seahawks and how they've fallen off. They've played a gauntlet of a schedule over the last month or so, and it's really just resulted in a slide from truly, a month ago, the conversation is whether or not they were going to be able to take the divisions from San Fran, and now it looks like they're going to be struggling to even get in as a 7 seed.
Yeah, I think we might be entering the last rebuild in the Pete Carroll era of the Seahawks. I think they probably have one more attempt at trying to reboot that, because he's getting up there in age, and he's a guy that's such an interesting personality. I just feel like he'll probably want to go a little more media side of things once retirement hits. So I think it's interesting to see how these next few years in Seattle go.
Absolutely. So with that, that'll close out our NFL A block for today. We'll be back in just a moment talking about the NBA and some of the trending headlines around that league.
Welcome back into the B-sides of sports. Today we will be tackling the Western Conference of the NBA and sort of some of the bigger storyline stuff that we're seeing. So opening things up, we have the soon-to-be return of NBA superstar Ja Morant on a team that really needs his help, currently averaging 106 points a game. The Grizzlies are dead last in the NBA in points per game, and points are what win you games. So obviously being last in that stat's never an encouraging thing. Wilson, if you're the Grizzlies sitting at 6-18, is Ja coming back at least something to look forward to and maybe salvage this season with a playoff berth?
Yeah, it's definitely something to look forward to. And with the plan, I think it makes a lot of things that previously did not feel possible feel a lot more possible. But even with that, I think the Grizzlies are just going to be battling to even make it in as the 10th team in that NBA play-in. I think right now, we're just looking across the West, the depth is insane, right? And when you go down the list of the teams that are overachieving, none of that success to me feels unsustainable, right? Just going 1 through 10 real quickly. The Timberwolves, Thunder, Mavericks, Nuggets, Kings, Clippers, Pelicans, Lakers, Rockets, and Suns. None of those teams to me, minus maybe the Rockets, feel like they're going to take any type of regression, right? And in some cases, teams like the Clippers, Pelicans, and Lakers are looking up in some ways, given their early season outlook. Even a team like the Warriors that are currently a full, let me do the math on that, 4.5 games ahead of the Grizzlies in the standings. It doesn't feel like that's a 5-game slide for them is going to happen at the same time a 5-game win streak can happen for the Grizzlies. And so I say all that to say I think the Grizzlies are going to be in a dogfight just to make it in to that 10th position. But I do think the return of Ja changes a lot of things. You mentioned how bad the offense has been, and in large part that's been for a number of reasons. One, Jaren Jackson Jr. has had a regression of a season. He has not been as good as he was last season. The post-ups have been less effective. He's been a super ineffective isolation player, bottom 5 in the league in terms of guys that have a minimum of, I think it was 2 or so a game, which it seems like a small number, but many players in the league aren't doing a whole lot of isolations every given night. As well as, just the over-reliance on Desmond Bane, right? Bane is really in that glorified Klay Thompson role. I think he's got a bigger bag than Klay does. Obviously not the knockdown shooter that Klay is, but not a more than a respectable one. And for all that to say, I think, a team that is so centered around their star point guard, right? Having him out for the first 25 games of the season, it really does play a large role. And it's, evidented by them only winning 25% of their games so far. I think that rate could go up to, much closer to 50%, but just being so many games back of that 10th positioning, I think it's just going to be a really, really hard road to climb. And I also think there's going to be a little bit of a gel period, right? This is a team that has gotten used to not playing with Ja for 25 games. And I just think, it speaks to the roster as a whole. The Grizzlies were excellent just a couple years ago without Ja, 20-2 at one point in that season. And, for them to be in 6-18, it speaks to the difference in personnel. And it also speaks to just the evolution or lack thereof of some of the players on the roster and kind of the way their games have culminated.
So I haven't watched a ton of Grizzly games in all transparency, but I just kind of want to touch on the personnel changes, like you said. So not only have they not had Ja for these 25 games, but Tyus Jones went over to the Wizards. So 2 of the best playmakers and facilitators on their team are gone through the first 25 games, and their offense looks stagnant, forced, and terrible. And it seems like everyone looks worse. And so I just kind of, to me, I'm entertaining the idea that I think maybe what this team's issue is more, it's this stagnation of offense when they don't have those playmakers out there. And losing Tyus Jones, I think, might have been a bigger loss for them than they expected because of this Ja Morant suspension. I mean, Ja, for as being as explosive of a offensive talent, always been a good passer in the league, has not averaged under 7 assists since he's been in the league. Oh, sorry. He averaged under 7 assists only once. And that was in his 28 points per game season. So a little more understandable to average under 7 assists a game. So I think what they miss more than anything about Ja is his ability to get the offense rolling and sort of, again, make it so that the defense has a harder task in front of them. And Tyus Jones did the exact same thing, right? Getting guys shots that they like to take. And so I think with Ja gone and Tyus Jones, we've really just seen that, man, maybe this Grizzlies team does, again, maybe it's not, to like a Moneyball aspect. Maybe it's not necessarily the missing so much of Ja as it is the assist numbers and the passing and the lack of a true facilitator.
Absolutely. And even, just the absence of Steven Adams, right? He's such a bone bruiser for them and just kind of the toughness he brought to that roster. I think the Grizzlies just kind of had an identity overhaul, partially just because of the personnel, right? And all that all together, just results in having a really slow start out the gate. And I just can't reiterate enough how tough it's going to be to put yourself back in the playoff picture when you're that many games out of it right now.
No, I agree. And with that, we'll go to our second topic, where we have the very tumultuous Draymond Green suspension. Obviously, it was just announced recently that for the punch to Yusuf Nurkic, he got himself an indefinite suspension, which the league is going to, pretty much how they seem to do it, is set a set of conditions that he has to meet to do it. And now, Wilson, Draymond Green currently sits second all time on the ejection scoreboard for NBA history, only under Rasheed Wallace. So, Wilson, what is kind of your thoughts with the most recent Draymond Green suspension?
Yeah, and that's a horrible list to be on, right? Rasheed Wallace played in an era where there wasn't a cap on the technicals, right? And in a league where there's been a very big push to avoid technical fouls and flagrant fouls and ejections, for Draymond to be so high on that list is not a great look. And, when you talk to people that really follow the Warriors and are really fans of what the Warriors have built over this last dynasty, you often hear that Draymond is the heartbeat and the soul of that roster, right? People, they're so willing to defend Draymond because of what Draymond has done. And to me, what I think is the reality for the Warriors is that every single year exists in a vacuum, whether we like it or not. And, it's just like if the 1999 Bulls tried to live off of what Michael Jordan was, right? It would have amounted to nothing, right? And I think that's what we see in today's Warriors, right? They're so stuck on what they were able to do in the past, what the team was able to rally, how good the core three, Klay, Steph, and Draymond, how they're able to play with each other. And the truth is that's not the addition of the Warriors we see today. Klay has obviously taken a regression, and to me it's a little saddening just given the injuries. Obviously, it's so tough for a guy to tear not just his Achilles but his ACL as well. And just for him to be back in the court and starting is an accomplishment in and of its own right. But that being said, this Warriors identity is they're just still stuck in what made them good. And I understand why that is, right? When you have that much success, it's why a guy like Bob Myers literally quit to walk away, because he didn't have it in him to be the guy to blow up that roster. But he saw the writing on the wall, right? Bob Myers knew this, it's what Barkley's been saying on Inside the NBA over the last couple of weeks. Like, Bob Myers didn't want to go down with the ship. And in what we're seeing, I think, is that Steve and Steph have such a loyalty to Clay and Draymond that they're not willing to have those tough conversations and take that step back, reduce their role, and elevate guys on the roster that are playing well. If you look at the roster top to bottom, guys like Kuminga, Moody, and even the rookie Brandon Pajemski, they're all playing at an incredibly high level. They're just given such limited opportunity because Kerr and Steph just feel such a loyalty to needing to be able to give guys like Draymond and Clay 30 minutes a night. And I say all that to say, with the suspension, I don't think Draymond will ever change. And honestly, kudos to him, right? At this point, he has built such a big brand for himself, and we know how successful Draymond's going to be post NBA. But I think even, the league is doing what they think is right in their eyes. But at the same time, I just don't think it's going to amount to anything. Do I think that Draymond might swing less a little bit? Sure. But do I think that the, arguing with the refs on every single play, just getting into the faces of the opponents, I don't think that's going away, because that's made Draymond, and he's so secure in that identity because of the success. And it all goes back to, they're living in the reality of 2015 to 2022, and we're currently sitting and going into 2024. And again, I can't fault them, because if I had that level of success, I'm sure it'd be hard for me to change my ways too. But I think all of that is going to amount in the Warriors being another one of those teams that probably are going to be fighting for the play-in all season, and I would honestly be surprised if they made it out of the play-in.
Yeah, so I always say one of the hard parts of being an NBA fan is the roster turnover in this league. And so I think what the Warriors maybe are doing, again, is you win a bunch of championships. Well, shoot, we're selling a boatload of tickets every night because Klay Thompson is probably a few million children's favorite player, right? So if you ship him away, you're losing a part of your share. So, and again, as far as I go for an NBA fan, as much as the Raptors are my favorite team, I'm more loyal to players, I feel like, than I am to them as a whole, which some fans find blasphemous or whatever. You can say whatever you want about it. So I think it also might be an issue of, again, I wonder how much stake again, this is kind of an absurd take, and I understand that, but I just wonder how much take ownership has in things like this, and upper management. Like you said, Bob Myers didn't want to go down and trade those players because he knows it's going to hurt their bottom line. It's going to hurt everything, but they might win games. But what if they don't? What if you trade Klay Thompson and you get significantly worse? That's a terrible look. You traded one of the cornerstones of your franchise and you're not selling as many tickets. So I know it's a little more abstract and outside of basketball, but sometimes you have to look to things like that to try and find it. And I think same goes with Draymond Green. It's crazy to me what they probably could have traded Draymond Green for in terms of value a few years ago, right? Coming off, again, he had a stretch with 3 straight All-Star games. Again, after 2020, you could have easily traded him, built a roster, get some young pieces. Same thing with Clay. You could have done the same thing with Clay after all of those injuries. Someone would have traded for him. He was a cornerstone of a dynasty. So I just think they kind of missed their windows with those guys. And I agree, where it's like, Draymond has made it clear this is who he is. So if you're the Warriors, you understand that. But I just think, again, you're already struggling to win games. You can't have one of your best players being off the court because of consistent antics, even though at one point won you games at a certain point. If I'm the Warriors, it's a business more than anything.
Absolutely.
And with that, we will go into now our second to last thing we wanted to talk about, and that is the LA Clippers. So the LA Clippers are a team that, a very interesting team, maybe one of the most talented teams. If you were to put all players ever in their prime, I mean, this team would just be an absolute nightmare. But now, after a pretty rough start, and then after a pretty good start, then the James Harden trade, then a bad stretch. Now, again, a good stretch, most recently 10-4, with James Harden being the starting point guard. We're finally starting to see some semblance. Kawhi is proving that he's the best player on the roster, and everyone else is starting to understand that and play off of him. Paul George, one of the best two-way players in the league, in my opinion. And then you have a guy like James Harden, who's proven himself to be an elite scorer as well as facilitator. Wilson, what do you kind of have to say for the Clippers and this newfound identity they have just 20, 30 games into the season?
Yeah, the turnaround has been incredible to watch, and it's really on the back of Kawhi Leonard, right? Kawhi has just been so consistent. He's been available every single night that the Clippers have needed him, really kind of knocking the load management moniker that's been given to him over the last couple of years, whether that's fair or not. And just seeing Kawhi really kind of reach that prime peak that we expected him to be at when he first went to the Clippers with Paul George, right? And this is kind of the last dance year for the Clippers, right? The contracts are going to be expiring. They're going to be moving to a new arena. And I think all of that kind of spurred Steve Ballmer's decision to make a drastic move and bringing in a guy like Harden. And I think we saw that shake of the snow globe really throw off the vibes around the roster a bit early on. But I also want to give credit to Russell Westbrook for what he was willing to do and coming to the team and announcing that he wanted to come off the bench, and really separating those Russ and Harden lineups has unlocked this Clippers roster. The starting lineup is incredibly dominant on both sides of the ball. Defensively, just Kawhi being re-engaged. We know the length that roster has top to bottom, and even Harden, right? When he's engaged, he is a strong defender. And then just the energy that Russ is able to bring off the bench and leading that second unit. That's a second unit that doesn't give you a single second to catch your breath, and it really exhausts the other team's starters. You're seeing that the second unit for the Clippers isn't able to hold on to the lead. They're able to extend it, and it gives the Clippers kind of this 1-2 punch throughout the first quarter of these games that a lot of teams just aren't able to recover after. They're really rolling as of late, winning 7 straight. I think it's 8 of their last 10 or 9 of their last 11. And it's just a really strong showing for them. Again, they're kind of in that middle ground in the West, right? We keep talking about this loaded Western Conference. I don't think a team in the West this year needs to be the 1 or 2 seed in order to feel like they're a true contender. I think the parity at the West is the highest it's been over the last decade. The Nuggets themselves, right, sitting at 10 losses just as the Clippers, they don't really feel like a juggernaut, right? And some of that's been the in and out health of Murray. Jokic has had a couple of rough shooting nights here and there. But I think it is this last dance kind of energy around the Clippers, right? And just going all in. If Paul George and Kawhi can truly stay healthy, I don't think, right, the knock on the Clippers would be in the postseason, will James Harden be able to be consistent and show up? I don't think that would be a concern with this roster because he'd be the number 3 offensive option. And we saw even last year, some of those postseason inconsistencies that have knocked Harden. While they do exist, that doesn't mean he's not able to help them win a couple games. He took over 2 of them for the Sixers. And so all that to say, I think the Clippers are really kind of pushing it all in to be a contender, because I don't know what this roster will look like next year, especially if the season doesn't go well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting. My only thing with them that I am a little interested in is is how they've kind of been dealing with, again, like you said, they have so many guys in that second unit. It's almost too many. So I wonder, again, like a guy like Bones Highland has played a shockingly little amount of basketball, and some coaches' decisions to not play him. So I'm just kind of curious to see going down the stretch how they end up. How does the bench shake out? Because I feel like you said, we're starting to see what the starting unit is, but I think, again, a lot of times it's your depth that can win you championships. Those Warriors dynasties of age old. One of the things I think that sticks out most to me was the bench depth with guys like Livingston, Leandro Barbosa coming off the bench. It really just provided such an interesting element. So curious to see how they figure that all out.
Most definitely.
And then going into our last topic for the day, we kind of have this new age issue of, role player versus star. A lot of too many cooks in the kitchen. You got 13 guys who like to shoot the ball, but again, how much of that was out of necessity, being on bad teams, etc. And Keegan Murray, just a few nights ago, had an insane 40-point game in which he hoisted 12 threes on 12 for 14 shooting, which is just absurd. Now, I believe he is second all-time and made in a game under just Clay's 14. Wilson, what's kind of your thoughts on this as a whole? I know it's interesting, right? Sacramento's got a lot of good players, so it's kind of hard for Keegan to get his shots in. But in a game like that, again, it's just there's a conversation that's got to be started. I'm not 100% sure on what, but there's something to talk about there. So what do you kind of think of all of this?
Yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to just say is it really speaks to how Steph's changed the league, right? A couple years ago, Keegan Murray is a role player. Don't make a mistake, right? He's not an all-star level guy. And a role player in a game hit 12 threes. And you said it, 12 of 15 shooting, just absurd efficiency. He actually started 12 of 13. Steph had 13 once. Clay obviously had the 14 three-pointer game. But, for a role player, truly, and he's a good role player, but for a role player to have 12 three-pointers in a game, 47 points, I just think it speaks to kind of the depth of the NBA's talent right now, the skills at an all-time high, the shootings at an all-time high. And with it, I think the conversation that I wanted to just have a real brief moment on is this over-evaluation of role players in the NBA. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to slight Keegan Murray. He's an incredible player. He plays incredibly well for what the Kings are asking him to do. But I was reading the comments on the post that had Keegan Murray with this 47. It was on X, Twitter, and this 47 points. And some of the comments were proposing if whether or not the Kings would be willing to trade Keegan Murray for Lauri Markkanen. Lauri Markkanen is a proven all-star level guy. He is the de facto number one option on the Jazz, and for a large part of the season last year, he was able to carry them. People were truly questioning whether or not the Kings would be willing to do a one-for-one trade for Keegan Murray and Lauri Markkanen. And again, I'm not trying to slight Keegan Murray, but I think it just speaks to how attached we as fan bases can get to role players. And I do it myself, right? A couple years ago, I would have told you that Tobias Harris was the number one option on any other roster, and right now we see that he's really just a glorified number three. And he is a really good number three option. Is one of the best in the league. But in no world would the Warriors have traded prime Klay Thompson for Tobias Harris, right? And so again, all that to say, I think we just have this kind of perspective. It's a little interesting because I think because of the flashes that some of these players are able to show, right? We look at Cam Thomas with the Nets. I just think that given the right opportunity in today's skill-based league with how important and potent shooting is, it's just really interesting to me. And I just thought that was a little funny reading that the Kings fans themselves weren't going to be willing to trade Keegan Murray for Lauri Markkanen, as if that wouldn't elevate the Kings to a whole nother level.
Well, yeah, and that's to me what's interesting, because I'm going to be honest with you. I would trade Pascal Siakam straight up for Keegan Murray, and that's just because we are terrible at shooting, and Pascal Siakam is just terrible. And in trade talks, now it is being said that Keegan Murray is apparently unavailable. The Raptors would be willing to ship OG Anunoby or Pascal Siakam are the guys they're looking to trade. One of the best two-way players in the league, a guy who led the league in steals per game a year ago, and a guy like Pascal Siakam who's proven to be a championship caliber number two. And they won't trade Keegan Murray for him. And I just think that's a little crazy. That's whereas, you went into the comments with the Kings fans. I find it more insane from a Kings perspective that, with his value being at a high, they wouldn't sell him high given the opportunity. That's what's more crazy to me than this sort of over evaluation by the fans. Because of course, these armchair GMs are going to say things like that. Right. And of course, again, I just said something like that, but the fact that the Kings supposedly aren't, now that's the crazy part to me.
Yeah, no, that is wild to think about. And I think, I would just go back to the Warriors again, right? The Warriors are so stuck because they're so close to the players in that locker room. And it even goes to what you were saying about the NBA at large with the attachment fans get to players, right? Because it is 82 games, because there are so many battles that we're witnessing every single night. You just, you view everything through a tinted lens when it comes to your own team. And I think that can kind of be the downfall of a lot of these rosters and their inability to adjust and make big moves at the trade deadline, right? And it's one thing that I think the NFL does incredibly well, right? The environment in the NFL is very cutthroat. As much as, players and teams care about chemistry, right? It's, 53-man roster, and every single one of those spots is incredibly important. So they're going to put the best people on that team. And that's something that I don't think we always see NBA franchises willing to do.
No, I agree. And again, that was really my biggest takeaway with that is, sometimes I think it's so interesting, especially with these young players. I think it's like you said, where if anyone gets the opportunity, it's just interesting to see how it could shake up. So, if I'm the Kings, again, if I was a GM and, again, like I said, I'm just an armchair GM, but, if I was a team, and I'm pretty consistent at turning young players into stars, which is what the Kings have been doing, I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't ship out this guy, crank up his value a little bit, trade him at the deadline. Maybe you can get a few more, players who are built, they fill the holes in your roster. This is a guy who obviously has shown he wants to be a high volume guy. I don't think any guy who's launching 14 threes in a game is a guy who wants to be averaging. I think he's averaging 13 or 14 on the year. I just think, again, you can get someone who can fill more holes better. And it seems like there's going to be a demand for this guy. Cause like you said, we're all talking about it and there's teams actively involved trying to get him and they're saying no. That's just kind of a questionable decision for me, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. So with that, that'll close out our B block, and we'll come right back in just a moment for our C block this week, talking about some of the NFL and NBA players Drake and I would like to see have a change of scenery. Welcome back into the C block of the B sides of sports. Again, this is our season 3, episode 10. And this week, Drake and I just wanted to have a quick conversation around some of the NFL and NBA players we thought would benefit from a change of scenery. So I'll quickly start with the NBA side of things. And to me, 3 names just popped in for a number of reasons. The first being Cade Cunningham. The Detroit Pistons are just absolutely shameful right now. I think they've really shut down some of the conversation around the NBA on whether or not there needs to be some expansion teams, because I think it's a tough conversation to have when you have 2 teams. And obviously the Spurs finally got a win against the Lakers the other night, but 2 teams in the Spurs and the Pistons that are truly just unable to win a single game, right? They had gone a month without wins after decent starts, right? Detroit 2-1, San Antonio 3-2 to start the season. It's just really, really sad to see. And in Cade's case, I just think he really needs to get away from that environment, right? Cade's a winning player, and a lot of us projected him to be a very strong NBA player, just the skill set he has, the size, the athleticism. For him to be sitting on a team that is currently 23 games in a row unable to produce a win, I think it's just a huge knock on the ability of the Pistons to develop as a player. So I really, really hate to see that. And 2 other names that came to me on that conversation were Laurie. Again, Laurie's a guy that he really was able to establish himself as the number 1 option in Utah. That being said, I'd really like to see Laurie just play a bigger role in the grand scheme of the NBA landscape. So going to a team where he'd be the number 2 or number 3 option, but really contribute to winning basketball. Because right now the Jazz are clearly trending in the wrong direction. And the final guy in that same exact mold is DeMar DeRozan for me. The Bulls are really going nowhere. The Lonzo injury really kind of detracted a lot of the momentum they had a couple years ago. And while it's a sad situation, I don't think DeMar's going anywhere on that roster. But that being said, I think DeMar still shows us shades of being a really good NBA player, and I'd really just like to see him get another chance to win an elusive NBA title for him. I really enjoyed seeing him on the Raptors. I know he was one of your guys, and there was a video of him and Kyle Lowry and Jimmy Butler hanging out when the Bulls went down to Miami just a day or 2 ago, and it just got me thinking how fun it would be able to see that that duo pair up again on a Miami team that would truly be able to contend for the title. I don't know exactly what the trade dynamics would be in that case, but I just thought that'd be a fun one. So Cade, Laurie, and DeMar are the 3 names that I came up with in the NBA for players that I just like to see in a different situation and just different circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of those guys you listed is already supposedly being shopped by the Jazz and Lauri Markkanen. The Bulls have already had conversations about blowing it up, and currently I've been letting Kobe White, who's been really stepping into, I think, trying to prove he deserves a chance at maybe getting a few more minutes and being a number 1 option. I think he's averaged over 23 points a game over the last 10 games or something like that. And then obviously DeMar, he's one of my all-time favorite players. He's top 3 favorite player of mine all time. So I would love to see him get a ring. I was lucky enough to be able to see Lowry get one. So, him and James Harden are 2 of my last top 3 favorite players who haven't won a ring yet. So I'd love to see that both those guys get an opportunity. And obviously it looks like the Clippers are, putting Harden in that position, but I'd love to see DeMar able to capitalize on that as well. And now going into my picks for the NFL, my first one is pretty straightforward, and that's Terry McLaurin. Washington's kind of a mess right now. They run a very spread offense. Despite having over 3,500 yards of passing, Terry McLaurin has under 700. Through 13 games, he's averaging under 50 yards a game. Now, this week, he did have an insane 11 catch, 149 yard game, finally realizing the potential, but it took Jacoby Brissett coming in and finally taking shots downfield, and as well as knowing who the best player is and taking a chance on it. So I just think at this point, if you're Washington, you're rebuilding. Terry McLaurin has an out in 2025 in his contract. Maybe instead of letting his contract defer, you trade him, you get some picks for him, you get your roster a little younger, try to build around Sam Howell, get him a guy he gels with a little more, because it just seems like they aren't necessarily on the same page. I mean, Terry McLaurin is on pace to have less yards than his rookie year, which he had 900 in. Has not eclipsed that 7 touchdown total since his rookie season, and just feels like it's going to be a career wasted in Washington.
Yeah, the chemistry between those 2 has been a little suspect all year, and it was so odd to see, right? The moment they took Howell out of that game and Brissett come in, it was instant. It was just McLaurin. They were moving down the field 10, 15, 20-yard chunks at a time. And a lot of that, the Rams were getting a little bit conservative. I know the defense had kind of, they weren't as engaged at that point in the game when they were up 3 touchdowns, but it was just so odd to see. And to me, it just questioned kind of the connection between Howell and McLaurin. Howell's really treated McLaurin like the number 3 receiver option when he has the talent of the number 1, right? And so just a little odd, and I agreed. It'd be fun to see him in a different system.
Yeah, because it's the emergence of Curtis Samuel, a college running back, switched to receiver in the NFL, struggled to find his place in Carolina, goes to the Redskins, struggles to find his place, but it seems like now he's finally getting back to what he was, and that's just kind of an elusive guy with the ball in his hands. Jahan Dotson, obviously a very talented player. Logan Thomas, very talented tight end, former quarterback, knows what the quarterback wants, so him and Sam Howell have been on the same page, but it just doesn't seem like Terry McLaurin isn't, and with so many teams, fighting to contend, and with wide receiver position, I'd say at an all-time high for value. I just think they could get a very good amount in a very loaded draft for him. So if I'm them, I'm trading him this offseason.
Definitely.
And so going into my next pick, this is a guy who I wasn't huge on for his first few years in the league, but recently have just kind of grown to appreciate for what he does, and that's Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is, I think, will go down as one of the true last of this generation, one of the last true bell cows. Now, again, I do think we will go back to it. Things are that way for a reason. For 50 years, teams won with defense and running. I think we're going to get back to that here sooner than a lot of people think. But Derrick Henry is just having a terrible year by his own accord. Lowest yards per attempt in his career, and despite the touchdown numbers being there, just not seeing the production. And I think a lot of that is with a guy like Derrick Henry. He's not very shifty. He's not very elusive. But what he is insanely hard to stop when he gets going. And that's what, Tennessee runs a lot of single back, which, most teams run about 70% of their plays out of the gun nowadays. So it's so interesting to see a guy who needs sort of an old school offense to thrive, but Vrabel hadn't always made that work until this year. And I think that's because of the O-line. The Tennessee Titans currently spend $18 million on their entire O-line. To put that into perspective, the Detroit Lions, Colts, Ravens, Falcons, Bengals, Texans, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Eagles all spend at least $40 million. There are 9 teams that spend at least $40 million on their O-line, and there are only 4 that spend under 20. And let me list off those 4: the Tennessee Titans, the Seattle Seahawks, the Chargers, and Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is last in rushing offense, despite having a good running back. Tennessee Titans just look terrible as a unit, and they can't run the ball because of a bad O-line. The Seattle Seahawks have had Geno Smith getting murdered every single week because they can't pass protect. And the Chargers just killed Justin Herbert. Austin Eckler's having a career-worst season. So you're looking at these figures, and you're starting to see the teams that are spending money are seeing a little bit more success. That's not always the case. But again, the Saints are just the top on every spending list because they just throw money at things and expect money to grow on trees or something. But outside of them, there's a lot of really good unit in that group. So all of this just to say, I think Derrick Henry has a few good years left. Very low on attempts early in his career, did not eclipse 200 attempts till his 3rd year in the league, and has since then had that in every single season. So I think on a team like maybe Baltimore, or I don't know, just a team, give him a 1-year, $12 million deal. Give him a chance maybe at 1 more year to get a 3-4 year contract, and then he can be out of the league. But it's just shameful that he's going to be spending his career, what seems to be the, tail end of his career as a non-starter on a team that just can't run the ball because they can't get the blocks up front for him.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the O-line spending, but when you put that figure into when you put that figure into context, right, it's just absurd to think about. I also think just, it's a young roster outside of Henry, right? And I think, they're starting to play a different style of offense, and I think it just makes it difficult for him to have that continued success. I also think backs having sustained success, for a long course of career, it's hard, right? The older you get, those 2,000-yard seasons become a lot more elusive. And yeah, I just think it's a tough position that Derrick Henry finds himself in.
Well, and yeah, and I'm sorry, I just can't get over how little they're spending per average annual value of a contract. Trent Williams and Quentin Nelson both make more money per year on average annual value than the entire Tennessee Titans O-line per this year of cap dollars. That's just insane to me. And I just think it's a shame because they have so many young playmakers, and they're in my division, so I shouldn't be rooting for them. But It's just I hate to see ineptitudes, and that's what their O-line is. It's just inept in every sense of the word.
Yeah, that's absurd.
And so my last one I think is probably my most surprising, and that's DK Metcalf. So the reason I think DK Metcalf should be gone is the same reason I just said earlier. I think Seattle has one last chance at a good rebuild with Pete Carroll before it's probably the twilight of his career. And so if I'm then, DK Metcalf is a guy, he's very hot-headed. I just think he needs a little bit more structure on a team, and maybe just a little more, of a veteran presence to hold him accountable. A guy like Geno, again, isn't very renowned in the league. he was kind of notorious early in his career for being a hothead, getting into trouble. Teammate broke his jaw, missed half a season, got benched, didn't play for the Jets again, right? So I'm not knocking Geno. I love what he's redoing with his career, but DK has just always been an odd fit for them. He had his most yards ever in his second season and still just seems to have a pretty limited route tree, relies a lot on his physicality. And all this to say, he's only 26 years old. He's very young still. He might be in his 5th year, but he's only 26. He also has an out in 2025. So similar to Terry McLaurin, if I'm the Seahawks, you just got Jackson Smith and Jigba. You love Ty Lockett, and he really just seems like the guy who's going to coast into the tail end of his career on Seattle. If I'm Seattle, a guy like DK, he's been causing issues, and every time they play San Fran, he seems to get ejected. It's just like, maybe get him out of that division, give him a breath of fresh air. That might be all he needs. The injury concern was initially why he dropped so far in the draft, obviously with those nerve damage in his neck, but one of the most one-of-one talents at receiver in terms of physicality as well as speed. So I just think what another team could do with him could maybe utilize him better, as well as help him just, mature a little bit. As we saw with guys like Baker Mayfield, it's pretty common to come into the league at 22 years old and be immature. And that's okay. I don't knock these guys for being hot-headed. They're competing at the top 1% of the players in their field. But, I just think maybe a change of scenery could help him, relax and, find himself, maybe, realize, hey, I don't really need to do this. I'm a really good receiver. I don't need to be German suplexing Fred Warner after he said nice tackle or whatever he said. It's just, to me, I think the change of scenery for him is less of a personnel issue and more of maybe just an opportunity to reinvent himself.
Absolutely. And for as talented as that offense is, right, the defense is pretty young. And I thought the defense would see kind of the leap that Kansas City's defense took. Obviously, it looks like they're going to need a little bit longer to develop and really get on the same page. And I agree. I just think DK being in a different system, a different environment, could just kind of hone in and just refocus on to like football, right? And just, what he's trying to accomplish at the receiver position. He had a couple years of just incredible production. And, this year there's been a little bit of influx in and out at QB. But yeah, I think DK would be a really fun player to see. Whether he was still the number 1 or if he dropped to the number 2 option in a loaded offense, I think it would reap benefits for his career.
I think he could benefit from being slotted as a number 2 just because, in terms of being able to try to get him favorable matchups, because he's just such a unique talent, and again, I truly do believe he is only 26 years old. He's still, in my opinion, a receiver really hits their prime, or if they should, with all things considered, around the time they turn about 28 when they've got it all figured out. So he's still got, in my opinion, 2 years before he's going to have the best 3 years of his career in terms of, just being a wily veteran. So if I'm him, I'd look at an opportunity, again, I wanted the Colts to get him when they drafted him, and the Colts have kind of loosely been shopping for wide receivers every year in the offseason as well as in the draft. So again, there's a lot of teams like that, as well as Tennessee. They're looking to get a young receiver to pair with their a young receiver talent to pair with their new young emerging quarterback. I think one of those teams could find a guy like DK instead of having to go to the draft and getting that guy who you can develop a rapport with one-on-one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take.
And with that, we will go to a close on this week's episode of B-Sides of Sports. Once again, we appreciate all the recent support, especially on TikTok and the YouTube Reels. We're just trying to keep finding new ways to conjure up new content, and we appreciate the support on those. Also, sorry about the runtime on these last few pods being a little bit longer. As we get into the bulk of the NFL season, right around playoff time, there is just a lot to talk about, and being on a weekly show format, it just does make it a little difficult. So once again, we do apologize and hope that our short form content can provide a little bit of relief to these little bit longer than usual podcasts. But as always, once again, thank you for all the recent support. Recently just hit 100 plays on our Spotify as a whole. We really appreciate that. And again, all of those links will be down below in the subscription. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. Any support is appreciated. And also comment what you think we could do better. Comment on what you think we said. Comment on anything, really. We really just love to hear feedback, and anything is welcome. So with that, we will see you guys next week. Later.